it struck me from the beginning as frankly immoral. And that's something that I've learned about myself since, that sometimes that moral response you have at the beginning is the right one. It's a good one. We're told too often to be systematic thinkers, to be logical, or even to be obedient and to trust experts, to follow the science. And actually, there are instincts and first reactions that we can and should listen to. So I had my own fear response. I was doing my own research. And the reason I started looking into the sorts of strategies that were used to encourage docility in the population is because the behavioral scientists put it out there. They weren't ashamed. They weren't hiding what they were doing. They were talking about it.
Hmm.
I'm an English graduate. I've studied, taken journalism course. I did quite a lot of linguistics at university too. You don't have to be any kind of particular genius to spot the sorts of tactics that were being used right from the outset. Very martial, wartime language, a lot of triadic structure. Here in the UK, we had things like hands, face, space. They're little earworms designed to get into your brain and affect you. And they eventually started publishing the minutes of meetings. And in one set of meeting minutes, the social scientists, SPI-B, Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, talked about how the government needed to increase the sense of personal threat that the complacent felt because they weren't going to follow the rules. And this was a truly astonishing thing to read from government advisors. So raising the sense of personal threat, i.e. frightening people, was official advice. And boy, did our government take it and run with it. They never explained who the complacent were, how you target them, how you define them, how you don't risk overly frightening those who already are terrified out of their wits. Because pandemics are frightening times. And again, this just struck me as completely immoral. It seems to me that no psychologist should be setting out to frighten people, even if it's supposedly in people's best interests to be compliant with rules that are supposed to be good for them. It was just obviously morally wrong. That's my starting point. And so I started researching who these people were and what they were doing.
Yeah, I was introduced to the nudge unit, and maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about the nudge unit.
Sure. Well, the nudge unit started here in the UK in 2010. It was set up under a Conservative government, and at the time it was 1/3 owned by the Cabinet Office, 1/3 owned by the founders of the nudge unit, and 1/3 owned by a charity called Nesta. It has since been bought out by Nesta, which has made a very tidy profit for the founders of the nudge unit, which was set up at taxpayer expense. The nudge unit is an organisation devoted to behavioural science. So, they'll have some really fluffy, charming way of describing themselves, but effectively, behavioural science is about creating choice architecture, so creating choices for people whereby they will be encouraged to make what's considered the right choice. It should always be about choice, not mandates, although we can get into that, how much choice there really is. It would be about, for instance, putting fruit, not sweets, by a supermarket till rather than banning sweets. That would be an example of a nudge. Now, nudge used to be considered a pretty fringe theory, and yet there are now about 300 nudge units around the world, which are embedded in governments or advise governments. So we have a nudge unit, which, while it's not part of the government anymore, it still very much has broad contracts framework with the UK government, and I'm sure it's in and out of number 10 all the time. But we also have behavioural scientists who work directly in the Cabinet Office and in other government departments and in government agencies like the NHS and DEFRA and the UKHSA. We also have SPI-B, this little group of social scientists that advise the government in times of emergency. So nudge is now everywhere. I mean, in some ways, I don't really have a problem with nudge. We're always trying to persuade people to do what we want all the time. We're trying to persuade each other right now in a conversation and trying to persuade your viewers that what we're talking about is important and it should change how they think about the world. Companies do it all the time. I do have a different issue though when it comes to governments having nudge units, because there's never been a democratic mandate for this. The kind of choices they're putting in front of you are supposed to work because they're at a kind of a pre-conscious level. They're working at a subliminal level. And that means you don't really know they're doing it. And we've never been asked if we want to be governed in this way. So while democracy should be about the will of the people from the bottom up, in a nudgeocracy, which I'd argue is what we're in some ways now, it's about government changing the will of the people from the top down, but without the people even knowing about it. They do things like work on obesity campaigns, try to discourage people from smoking, reduce knife crime. And on the face of it, it's quite hard to take issue with campaigns like that. They sound pretty good, don't they? I mean, on one document I read somewhere from behavioural scientists, they talk about wanting to help us lock up the biscuit tins. Well, a lot of people want help locking up the biscuit tins. When I became alive to the nudge unit, is when they locked us up, when
Yeah.
they used all the tools at their disposal to encourage us to stay indoors, stop working, stop being educated, have vaccines, wear pointless masks on our face, etc.
Yeah, what's interesting for me as a psychologist, I'm aware of a lot of the techniques that were outlined in your book because part of our job is to influence behavior change. When that
Mm.
behavior change is kind of universally viewed as something that is positive, like to improve health promoting behaviors, to improve relationships, things that are generally accepted to increase the value and purpose of our lives, I think, generally speaking, people understand how these behavioral methods can be utilized in positive ways. The question is when there's a kind of a dark underbelly and aspect to this to controlling behavior to in order for institutes aspects of control to in a lot of ways just advance the agenda of a small group of people, potentially even against the freedom and liberty of the masses, and even in some situations as we've seen throughout history like Nazi Germany, to actually participate in atrocities. So it's the intention of the behavior change matters. And you use the word mind virus. And I think it's the best way to describe what really infected a lot of people during this time because there was a complete disconnection from reality. Fear impaired our ability to think logically. I'll never forget this session that I had with a client during the pandemic. And this was months and months in. At this point, the data was fairly clear that the most vulnerable were the ones who were very ill and who were old. So, yes, if you had multiple comorbidities, you were elderly, you were at much greater risk of having a negative response or even die from this virus. But the general speaking, healthy people, young people, really not at risk at all. In fact, so many people got infected with the virus and hardly even knew that they had it. So there was a young, healthy woman in front of me, and I just asked her some questions regarding just logical analysis about the degree of threat, because that's the thing about fear; it can over exaggerate threat. And I said, so what's the likelihood percentage wise that you're going to obtain the virus, and what is the percentage that it could have severe health consequences and even death? And she said to me, I think it's about 50-50. Like if I become infected with this virus, there's a 50% chance the consequences will be quite severe and I could even die. And I said, wow, I mean, if that was the case, I would not be sitting in front of you right now. I'm not I'm not flipping a coin whether I'm going to live and die by having a session with you where you're sitting, 4 feet in front of me. But really, logic was suspended. So, Laura, I mean, how was fear weaponized against us? What were some of the messages that were so carefully constructed to provoke and maintain fear during that period?
Oh my goodness, there were so many ways. I mean, I want to say something about that assessment of risk to you because I think that is really interesting. I mean, people aren't very good at statistics numbers in general. There was one study in the UK, and it showed that the British public thought that 6 to 7% of the population died from coronavirus.
Mm.
Now, that was about 100 times the actual death rate. If that many people had died, the streets would have been lined with bodies. But
Yeah.
they couldn't kind of work out what the numbers would be and what that would look like. So figures were used to bamboozle, confuse, and upset and disrupt and reframe all the time. That's a technique that's used, disrupt and reframe. You talked about how people can't think logically when they're frightened. Well, of course, this is why fear is used. Can I just say something before I go into the tactics? Because I get really upset about this. I think it is absolutely disgusting that people in government and psychologists thought it was okay to use fear to encourage docility. We had some leaked WhatsApp messages from government ministers and our own Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Okay, this is the chap in government in charge of health, said we must frighten the pants off everyone with the new strain. So they were holding this kind of new strain. I can't remember what code they eventually gave it. We called it the Kentish variety here. They're kind of holding it in their back pocket and working out when to tell people to frighten them so that they would cancel Christmas. One of the founders of the Nudge Unit wrote a kind of mea culpa in one of the publications over here and said that one of the most egregious mistakes in the pandemic was the level of fear that was deliberately conveyed upon the public. The cabinet secretaries, that's the chap in charge of the civil service, basically, agreed that the fear and guilt factor was vital in communicating with the British public. This is disgusting. This is how they were thinking of us. Like we're very naughty, bad children who need to be frightened to do what we're told. And yet it is so well known that fear affects mental health and physical health and could have long-term ramifications. Now, the head of the Nudge Unit, David Halpern, was talking about the use of fear in one of our big newspapers, The Telegraph, and he showed not only no remorse for having weaponized fear, but obviously still believed it was a really good thing, really doubling down, saying that the use of fear is right if you have to recalibrate how people think. Now, you don't normally talk about calibrating brains, you talk about calibrating bits of machinery. So you really get that kind of flavor of technocratic thinking. Oh, people need to be calibrated. Well, they got the risk wrong. They told us that we were all equally at risk. We weren't, that we had to act like we've got it, which is mental. No one's ever been told this before. Act like you've got a disease that you don't have and don't have any symptoms of. And what was really disturbing about this interview with David Halpern in the Nudge Unit is he said the British public will follow stay-at-home orders again, easily and willingly, because we know what the drill is. That was the term. We know the drill. So we've been drilled. We've been drilled. It's hard for me to convey how disgusting I think it is for people in public health, psychology, and government to talk about it this way. So how did they do it? How did they frighten the public? One thing was the use of numbers and statistics. Now that creates salience. Big numbers stick out in your brain. You remember them. You'll see this a lot with climate change since. So they would talk about the number of people who had been admitted into hospital. And it was very sneaky the way they did it, because they would use a big number, which actually included people who'd been admitted to hospital with COVID, but it also included people who had caught COVID in hospital, but they never split it out. They didn't tell you the difference. So it was a kind of inflated number. Also, they'd focus on hospital admissions, but they would never talk about hospital discharges or recoveries. So you'd have the sense of people going to hospital and they never come out because they would never talk about that. They would also talk about deaths and hospital admissions every single day. Now, you'll know in psychology there's something called the truth illusory effect. If you repeat something often enough, it becomes very much fact for people. I'm not saying these figures weren't fact, but they were inflated and they were focusing on the negative and not the positive. So that was being drilled into us every day. Masks themselves, I would argue, were deliberately used as a signal. That's one of the parts of my book, A State of Fear, which was considered controversial, but I'm only saying what the behavioural psychologist said. David Halpern said in a select committee to parliamentarians that the mask was a signal.
Mm-hmm.
And then he
Conditioned
talked
fear
about the
response.
underlying evidence. It's a signal. It turned us into walking billboards for danger.
Yep.
Of course, that's not necessarily how sociology, psychology, and physics works. I'm not saying it's necessarily they've done exactly what they wanted. There are even some studies that show that wearing masks may have increased risk because people then stood much closer to each other. Anyway, lots of advertising. So the UK government and the NHS here in the UK became one of the biggest advertisers in the media. And I think they spent more than has been spent on communications since the Second World War. I don't have the latest figure, but it is something mind-boggling and eye-watering. Some of the campaigns were really unpleasant. There were hundreds and hundreds of them on social media. There were TV, billboard, magazine, radio, newspaper ads. And they'd say things like, act like you've got it, which I've already said is a completely mental thing to say to people. There was one targeted at teenage boys, which really stood out at me because I have teenage boys. And it said, hanging out in the park could kill. Well, I don't think teenage boys hanging out in the park ever killed. Don't let a cup of coffee cost lives. That was supposed to deter people from doing something that was entirely legal, which would be getting a takeaway coffee and going for a walk with a friend. If you think about it, going for a walk with a friend with a cup of coffee may have been life-saving for somebody who had really bad mental health problems and lived on their own. But no, don't let a cup of coffee cost lives. Then there was the quite infamous campaign called Look Him in the Eyes and Tell Him You Never Break the Rules. So a big close-up of somebody's face, very, very grainy, with a sort of a horror film aesthetic, with a mask on the face and the big eyes looking at you. And of course, when you see eyes, it makes you feel like you're being watched. So again, this is well known in psychology, that if you feel like you're under that watchful eye, you will behave yourself more because you feel like you're being spied on, being observed. So a lot of money spent on advertising. There was also a narrative that was constantly pushed that people who followed the rules were COVID heroes and people who didn't were COVIDiots.
Yeah.
You would see newspapers running articles about people at the beach on a bank holiday and calling them COVIDiots or selfish. And again, they weren't actually doing anything that was illegal, and it would be hard to think of anything that would be better than being in the sunshine and the fresh air in an outdoor space, but there we go. A particularly egregious type of shaming was targeted specifically at children, which was really unpleasant. And we're not the only country to have had that. There was something similar in Germany, and I bet it happened in lots of places. Our own health secretary actually parroted it himself, don't kill granny. So that was supposed to make children and young people be very vigilant about their behaviour. But of course, what was horrible about it was it's elderly people who were going to die. It's always the elderly who were going to die. And it was never going to be the grandchild's fault. It would simply be an artefact of their grandparent being elderly. It was a horrible, horrible moral burden to place on young people. How else did they frighten us? Well, I think those are some of the key ones. So PR, advertising, cherry picking statistics. Oh, the daily briefings. There were daily briefings on TV, and they would have the experts on podiums. And they used a kind of a ticker tape around them, which was yellow and black stripes. I mean, these things, once you become alert to them, they're really obvious. That looks like the kind of tape you would have at a police disaster area, making sure people don't cross the line because it's dangerous, or it's like the yellow and black of a wasp. This will sting you. It's very much a do what you're told colour. When we moved into the summer, when things kind of opened up again after so-called Freedom Day, that changed to yellow and green ticker tape. So, they'd use colours to sort of make the message harder or softer. And these briefings on TV were given quite a martial tone. They would use wartime language. They would talk about the battle as though a virus is an enemy that can be defeated or turned on and off like a tap at the government's behest. And of course, it's nothing like,